The Atlanta Fed president has been outspoken in the months since the police killing of George Floyd that sparked national protest and dialogue about race and inequality. In fact, he wrote in a powerful essay back in June that systemic racism is a yoke that drags on the American economy. So, Raphael, we want to dig into now this whole question that you so eloquently highlighted back then. You're doing a lot of work on this since then, and throughout the Federal Reserve, there's a lot of work. 6 months after the fact, almost, what is at the top of your list now? What have you learned about what needs to be done? And what's most important thing for the Fed and its like-minded agencies and government officials to be focused on now?
Well, first of all, this has been such an important topic, and I've been really gratified by how many people have read the essay and said, I understand, I want to step forward and make a difference in this. I think there are a couple of things that jump out to me. First is acknowledgement that this is a problem and that everybody needs to take it seriously and everyone needs to participate to try to make a difference on this. A second thing that I try to tell people is that although this is a problem that emerged over decades and many, many years and many institutions that have impose racism, small actions can make a difference. And so we all need to have accountability in terms of how we engage with the people who we live with and work with and engage. And then the other thing is to really find solutions that are actionable. And a lot of the events that we have now started convening are about what things can we do to change the narrative and change people's understanding about what the barriers are and what possibilities are. And I'm really excited because so many business leaders, so many community leaders, and so many public officials have all said this is something that I am redoubling my commitment to, and I want to get a deep understanding on this so that I can make some real change.
Raphael, housing, we talked a little bit about it earlier, and I want to call a bit on your background. You were at the Housing and Urban Development as one of their top directors. You were on the board of Freddie Mac for a while. So you have not just theoretical study knowledge, you know about it. Mortgages still cost Black and Hispanic homeowners considerably more every year than they do everybody else. What's wrong? Is that something that can be fixed?
Well, I actually think I think so. There are a couple of pieces to this. One, I think we actually have to really think about making sure that African-American families and Latino families know how to manage their credit from very early ages. We know that credit scores are lower for Black and Hispanic families than they are for others. And that really is about decisions and choices that people are given really early on. So we can make a difference there. A second thing that I think we need to think about is how do we think about risk in neighborhoods? We just hosted a conference a couple of months back at Princeton where we had a historian who came and spoke and told us about how all these preconceived notions about risk in neighborhoods, and particularly in minority neighborhoods, caused them to want to fund things at higher costs. And so we have to attack those narratives so that the same sort of risks are appreciated and treated the same in minority neighborhoods and in white neighborhoods. And then the other thing I would say is that there's some research that shows that African Americans in particular, and research by staff here at the Atlanta Fed, have really tried to identify and respond less powerfully to economic incentives. The research showed that when we did quantitative easing and mortgage rates fell very dramatically in the early 2010s, African Americans didn't refinance nearly as ruthlessly as white homeowners did. And that meant that they were paying higher rates than they probably needed to. And so we have to figure out what is driving that so we can get to a place where they take advantage of their opportunities just as much as everybody else and don't carry burdens that are not necessary.
So, Raphael, is it then more about raising awareness, changing the narrative, as you're saying, about these racial gaps, or is it about setting specific short-term policy targets at the Federal Reserve?
I actually think it's a little of both. And we have conversations about this at my bank, among our leaders, and also with my colleagues. We spend a lot of time thinking about how are our policies impacting our staff as well as the communities around us. And we want to make sure that we are being true to inclusion and diversity when it comes to things like supplier diversity, when it comes to paying living wages, when it comes to thinking about seemingly mundane things like reimbursement policies, which can impose really different types of burdens on staff depending on their economic means. And so I want to make sure that we as an institution are responsible in that. And then also, one of the things that I've really been gratified by is that so many business leaders have looked at their staff and said, does my leadership look like my rank and file? And these are metrics that we can use to really identify places where our policies and practices may not be matching some of the principles that we have in our vision and mission statements. And I think those sorts of explorations can be very helpful as signaling mechanisms for the leaders, certainly, but also for the staff, and give them a sense that if they work hard, their chance for improvement and moving forward is actually greater than probably it was before.
Does that mean then what the President-elect Joe Biden is calling for when it comes to an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act that would require the Fed to regularly report on racial gaps is the least that could be done?
Well, to be honest, the Fed is doing this already. They may not do it on a regular basis in a public setting, but I'm routinely in briefings with my team where we report on these gaps. So we're aware of them. And I think what has really changed is a broader willingness in society to talk about them and engage in them. And that's the thing that's really changed. And I think if you look at the Federal Reserve and our engagement on issues around racial equity and on diversity, we've become extremely vocal on this, and we are going to stay that way. I think this is a change that is going to be enduring, and it's going to allow us to impact people's understanding about these issues along multiple dimensions, even dimensions where our policy tools may not be the ones that are actually going to move the dial.
I want to come back to housing, Raphael, because ever since I read this story a couple weeks ago, I've been thinking about interviewing you. And it was a story on Bloomberg about a black realtor in the Northeast who says this hot housing market is great for some, certainly if you're a seller, but I have a lot of clients who are getting priced out. A lot of black people who want to buy houses, wealthier, more affluent white people moving, whoever's moving from the city to get out to the suburbs. And so it's an unintended consequence, but it is a consequence. Is there some policy step that needs to be taken? Do you just have to say, well, there's winners and losers when you're trying to keep things going and get things going as the Fed?
Well, I think we have short-run issues and long-run issues. And when we think about the distribution of housing and where people live, I think there is actually a long-run issue as well. And we have to think about how and where we build housing and how much housing we build and at what price points. There's so many communities where there isn't a diversity of option for families if they wanted to live in those communities. And so they do find that there are constraints on the supply of housing that they can have access to. I think we need a robust conversation around how do we make sure that every community is accessible in ways that can help those communities be stronger and more robust and more resilient. And when I lived in Los Angeles, we had a tremendous shortage of units, and that imposed costs on the entire region. People had to live far, far away from where they worked. It added to congestion on freeways, and that was a cost that we all bore, and it was kind of just something that we all just took. And I don't think enough people recognize that that was in part a function of how we do our housing and how we build it and the patterns that we are willing to engage in. So I think we need a whole rethink on this. And if we do that, I think the likelihood that this kind of crowding out of certain people based on their income levels will be much less likely to happen.
As a man, African-American man who's been very successful, president of the Atlanta Fed, that's no small accomplishment.
It's not bad.
PhD from Stanford University, very successful economics, yet people say the Fed, the economics profession, are very racist, very sexist. I'm curious if you found that along the way, and if you did, how did you deal with it? What do you advise young people who want to maybe follow in your footsteps to do? Well,
I think economics as a field is actually very difficult for those that don't come from the traditional economist backgrounds, minorities, women, immigrants to some extent, all are at a disadvantage because to some extent, the field is not really built to support them and provide that kind of connective tissue, if you will, as to how we should approach it. For me, I actually feel like I got super lucky. And I found some mentors in graduate school, and as I was coming up through the ranks, who basically, every time I fell down, picked me up and said, you gotta keep going. You have talent and you can move forward. And what I would say to people who are thinking about this, so African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, women who want to get into this field, have faith. There are many more out there than I think people acknowledge that want to provide that support. And so, it's hard work for sure, but I actually think that this is as good a time as any for us to increase diversity in the field.
What sort of support do you want to see from the incoming Biden administration when it comes to closing these racial disparities?
Well, I'm not going to, it's not my job to provide support, to provide advice to the incoming administration. But what I would say is we have to think about root causes. When we're running a webinar series called Racism in the Economy, and we're trying to speak to a number of the root causes that have contributed to these sorts of disparities. Things like employment law and how we treat temporary workers. Things like how healthcare plays out. We've talked about housing and the burdens that particular families have. And I think you must also talk about the criminal justice system, where sentencing and the approach has fallen disproportionately on African-American men. If we're going to find ways to narrow these gaps, we've got to understand what the barriers are and what the challenges are in all of those areas, and then find solutions that we can implement and that we can sustain to move forward so that we don't lose the people who've already got caught up in that, and we can prevent those new people from getting caught up in that moving forward.